Hello and welcome back to Beyond the Veil with the background information. This time we're going to talk about vampires. Why the hell have I decided to talk about vampires? I don't know, but it's going to be a long one, so apologies for that. And for my patrons, they're getting this in February, and for the people on YouTube, you'll be getting this in March. So let's just get right into it now. All that stuff about drinking blood to survive, seducing, elitism, and yet beneath a demonic being with no love for anything but himself. Yes, I'd say that rounds it up for Talism. Maybe most vampires too, but it's a demon-inherited thing, I'm sure. Quote from Beauregard in The Last Rattle, which is one of the Viper Clan stories. Vampires. Pretty much everyone has an idea of what I'm talking about, but at the same time, you'd be wrong and I'd be wrong. The situation with vampires and their representation in media is not what the original vampire is all about. I'm going to discuss in brief what real vampires are in folklore, and then I will talk about literary vampires, which is where the majority of inspiration comes from before I will discuss my vampires. Firstly, I'll say this much. I never wanted to call them vampires, but the problem is in literature, if you write a handsome character that seduces to drink blood and has this elitist manner, then it can only be called a vampire. If you give it a different name, people question why you have to advertise and say it's vampire-like, because sadly a lot of things aren't picked up unless they have a common name other people can understand. Now, a lot of the authors in paranormal romance I read have tried different interpretations. Lindsay Sands has hers as Atlanteans that have used technology to make them age less and more healthy by taking in blood, but they are still called and referred to as vampires. Christine Feehan has been called a Carpathian, who is both similar to a vampire and yet very different, and yet the stories of the Carpathians still get processed as vampire literature. I don't actually enjoy vampires because of the literary use that always sort of went against the kind of person I was. I liked werewolves because I liked to think that something could not be inherently bad, and yet vampires were bad and played off for their sexuality. Later, getting older, I still maintained this irritation about vampires until I randomly found something called JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and met Dio Brando, my favourite vampire. Why? He was not elite to start with, he went totally evil as a vampire, kept doing evil things, and the first image of him I saw was the dead women's bodies around him he'd sucked dry, and I thought, now that's what I call a vampire, so evil. So, when I made the vampires for the Viper Clan, I made them different. Their blood has more human, but also demon in, so they're not the same, and Fia's teaching changes them. But now let's talk about vampire folklore. What are vampires like in folklore? The most common name I used to hear for the folklore origin is the Romanian Strigoi, but also the Germanic Nuxera or Night Chewer. These are spirit beings that return from the dead to drain blood from the living. They could live off any other life essence, but blood was the main thing to match the sight of blood around their mouths, the ruddy complexion of their recently deceased, and their bloated forms. Now, we all know that this is normal within the decomposition of bodies that bloat with gas, vessels burst, and skin retracts to leave corpses looking clawed and fanged. But if you're not used to seeing it, and you keep having visions of the dead and the family getting ill and viruses weren't really understood, it can make sense to think it's something demonic. It's from seeing this that various methods were used to deal with the vampire, from stuffing a brick in its mouth to keep it chewing that rather than seeking out others to chew on. We found people in Italy buried like this from plague times, to the tradition of staking witnessed in the Balkans and Romania in particular. This was deemed to calm the restless spirit or dispatch it properly so it would not harm the living, and that in essence was the origin of the vampire. Now, this is very different from literature, and that's all because of one man. Not the first to write about it, but the first to get very successful and set the trend. Firstly, we mention The Vampire by John William Polidori, which is based on Byron's vampire story, which first creates the handsome vampire nobleman in a romantic story and coined the term everyone in literature used, vampire, and its popularity brought out the interest in paranormal romance and how it really fitted the Gothic movement in literature at the start of the 1800s. It's not really died down as much as you might think, but really, the blame for how all vampires are viewed comes from Bram Stoker's Dracula. I'm not going to discuss the namesake, but explain why it worked, even more than the vampire, to get people's attention. To begin with, at the time it was out, there was a lot of migration from Eastern Europe and a lot of focus on empire, with lots of stories of bizarre customs and histories being open to those who had money to visit or buy a book about the place someone else visited. With this idea came the usual thoughts of foreigners taking jobs, stealing women, and in a climate where murder was now more commonly discussed and crimes brought fascination to an otherwise gloomy public, and the literacy rate was increasing. The climate was right for a villain of Eastern European origin to prove that not only were they up to evil, but evil itself, by using the name of someone whose actions in real life shocked the world to give it some real foot in reality, and that was Dracula. From the seduction, the ability to take control of others, transform at will, and just dominate the backwards landscape still living in serfdom, Dracula can be viewed as a big chunk of propaganda against the foreigners coming in, but it propelled to something more than that. Its arguably sexual content for the time, let alone the exoticness of the tale, spoke to people wanting this kind of story with clear villains and devil-like attributes, and using a fang penetrating to cause blood. Well, it was practically another way of stealing ladies' virtues for a much more indecent and unnatural manner that really threw the vampire into the position of the seducer, representing everything good people should not go for, the ultimate bad boy. You can probably tell how much I abhor Dracula, but in general the vampire soon became turned into something more sexy. The guy can have as many girls as he wants, or even the girl, cough, Camilla, cough. In literature, it suddenly became just the mainstay in horror, split between two genres. For horror, it was being incapable of dying, with servants everywhere turning the town, and being a true villain because it lusts for blood and wants to feed off and rule all humanity as it should. For paranormal romance, it proved the ultimate bad boy fantasy, the aloof, handsome, rich man with a dark secret that only the woman with the right kind of heart could help, and that wishes redemption. One side demon villain, the other side cursed with immortal loneliness. It can also be obvious to see why it has maintained a popular icon, and in fact is the majority of paranormal fiction protagonists. But it also works as a rhetoric to the upper class, or indeed the ultra-rich, the people who can get away with murder and live off others, in vampire cases quite literally, and can propel the underdog to heroic heights, whether by staking them in the heart or just owning their heart. Just weirdly versatile like that, and so remotely away from the initial folkloric thought that you might as well have given it a different name. But the good thing with this is that the idea of a vampire as something real that means you have to violate a corpse with a hunk of wood or a brick is not necessary. The vampire is now viewed as totally fictional, and as such I'm almost done talking about them with my own interpretations. And well, these days fictional vampires have a lot of inspirations from Incubus, but only in its sexual lore. Now, to talk about my vampires as briefly as possible, as their cultural aspects, like the Noble Circle Commission and whatnot, for the Veiled Culture section, like I've previously done the Permission video. Right, side. Various but mainly independent and more about ruling Earth than themselves. Created by the mingling of the Lilitu, Succubae, and other demons with desires for living essence and a high sexual drive paired with the last Nephilim and its latest spawn, the Elder, that feed off the life essence of the environment to create something that can survive off the essence of only living beings, and later their preference for blood, which became the easiest method as just a kiss could get what they wanted, and sexual activity became more awkward when permission was introduced, and the blood used in accepting it encouraged everyone to stick with blood, wanted blood. Created for part of the mingling of demonic elements and lingering aspects of angel and human from the Nephilim. Created when? See created by. Physical description. Most vampires tend to be physically attractive to humans. They are often slim, though, because their body voids excess, so putting on weight can be quite difficult, but also muscle with alterations in the genetic aspects. They come in all nationalities and can look just like ordinary people, but slightly exotic, always alluring and unable to be forgotten. When the demonic side is aggravated, however, and they must fight demons or other beings of the veil, they revert to the huge, fanged, bat-like creature with a slitted nose similar to the leaf on some bats, greyed skin, and a look more akin to their succubus and Lilitu ancestors, with clawed feet and horrifying screeching sounds, but often viewed as like giant bats. Even in human form, or when feeding, the vampire's jaw flexes and stretches like that of a snake, allowing them to devour flesh as well as blood, but also to hold on to their prey for drinking more efficiently. The fang itself is a hollow tube like the fang of a snake, very sensitive and often quite weak, and sits within a larger and longer canine tooth that works like a protective sheath. The fang is only visible when the vampire is aroused to feed or even sexually aroused. Abilities. Immortal as long as they maintain a reasonable supply of blood or living energy to repair cells. Increased strength, transformation, the ability to digest other beings thanks to their demonic heritage. Increased speed, ability to fly when transformed. Ability to turn into smaller bats to spy. Ability to hypnotize with pheromones to encourage others to listen to them. They are all able to pull limbs back together and survive damage to heart or even brain so long as there is blood available or within it. They have excellent reflexes, increased intelligence, keen hearing, and keen eyes in low light. Most known for drinking the blood of others, which is deemed more violent than claiming souls. Weaknesses. Sunlight can be too extreme for their bodies, causing cells to burn away, and without good genetics from damp here in the bloodline, it cannot heal its skin quick enough without blood on hand to step into direct sunlight. Sometimes thick glass can help protect, but the older the bloodline and the purer, the weaker the sunlight. They can be weakened by staking as it stops blood flow, and if damaged enough, they cannot repair and the skin starts to shrivel. They can be put out in the sun and killed this way, as long as the blood is drained from their bodies. They are weak to attacks from demons, iron wolves, and they take longer to heal from attacks by werewolves and strix. They also have terribly low birth rates, with so many females dying in childbirth, along with the child due to rapid blood loss, as 7 out of 10 births will include a hemorrhage. Number. There are about 7 million vampires in the world by 2020, including turned. But before, their population was very low and restricted to about 50,000 until the 1900s, when the veil agents and developments in medicine allowed them to breed more successfully and integrate more with other beings. Most well-known beings, there are quite a few depending on your country, but the main ones have always been the Pipistrello, which have included the second Vampire King and arguably the third, and everyone in the Viper clan, and the Vilmors, not for good reasons though. Characters and stories. The Viper clan in total are vampires, after Fear is turned, then Tamsin Vilmore II turns up a lot in stories, predominantly as a villain. Final comments. I always had this ability to write vampire stories, and whenever I write them for people in fan fiction or as new fiction, people seem to always enjoy them, even if I rub my temples and grumble. The Viper clan are different because they're not like the other vampires around them, but I love their stories. Though still, why did I have to write about vampires? Anyway, thank you for listening, and of course, as always, thanks to all my lovely patrons.